think people assume that if they're a good software engineer, they should be able to do well in interviews. And I can see how people get there, but that is such a big mistake. Not taking the proper time to actually prepare will almost virtually guarantee you're not going to pass the interview.
Yeah, preparing for an interview and preparing it well is half the battle, as Mike Mroczka, my guest for this episode, has just said. And he should know. After all, he's written a book about it, Beyond Cracking the Coding Interview. And over the next few minutes, we look at how interviewing and coding tests have changed in recent years, what the common pitfalls are in interviewing, and what you could do to get ready.
You got very good marks.
Well, I don't care. I want to know what's going on. I think you're deliberately trying to humiliate people. I'm going straight out. I'm going to tell the police exactly what you do to people. And I'm going to make bloody sure that you never do this again. There! What do you think of that? What do you think of that?
Very good marks.
Oh, well, do I get the job?
Well, I'm afraid not. I'm afraid all the vacancies were filled several weeks ago.
If you've been working long enough, you might have gone through one or two harrowing job interview experiences, although I must confess few could be as bizarre and silly as the extract from the Monty Python clip you've just heard. But let me tell you that in my time, I've been through a few very weird ones. But daunting as they can be, interviews are a part of our professional life, and we all have to go through it at least once in our career. In fact, many of us go through it a few times, in particular in research where projects and project fundings are mostly time-limited, or in software engineering in general, where people change jobs rather frequently. Engineers, for instance, might stay 3 to 5 years in a role, sometimes a lot less, and in companies I worked at, the annual turnover of 1 in 7 or 8 was considered to be normal. In short, chances are you'll be polishing your CV and going to job interviews a few times in your life. Some of the recruitment processes can be quite formal, as in, for instance, filling out an application form rather than sending a CV and facing an interview panel. That's often the case for academic roles or positions in the public sector. In the private sector, recruitment processes can vary a lot, but they usually come in separate stages. Typically, there is a screening interview which, once you passed, is followed by a single or perhaps several in-depth interviews. Some interview processes have become quite famous, or perhaps I should say infamous, like the interview processes at Google or Facebook, as they were once called. But no matter what the actual process is like, for technical roles there'll be one common, or at least one common stage, the coding interview. And this is where we have seen a lot of changes in recent years, and which brings me to Mike Mroczka, who I got in touch with earlier this year, 2025. As I mentioned at the start, he wrote the book Beyond Cracking the Coding Interview, but Mike is also a software engineer who's been interviewing for roles himself a few times, so you might say he's been eating his own dog food before writing the book. And I wanted to pick his brain and find out how interviewing for technical and engineering roles has changed. What are the common pitfalls, and what can you as a candidate do to prepare for an interview? So let's hand over to Mike now.
My name's Mike. Last name's Mroczka. It's Polish, and if you never pronounce that correctly, that's fine. I'm not easily offended. I am a software engineer. I've been a software engineer for about a decade. And I've done work at big tech companies like Salesforce and most recently Google. And then I left Google to write a book, and I'm an author of a book, which, by the way, is everyone romanticizes writing a book. And I just have to say it is a painstaking process. So definitely not something I recommend. But yeah, that's a little bit about me.
Okay, and it's the book that we're going to talk about because it's the Beyond Cracking the Coding Interview, isn't it?
That's correct.
And you're one of the co-authors.
Yes, yeah. I wrote with 4 other people. I kind of had a lot of help with it. So the original book was called Cracking the Coding Interview, and that was actually released by Gail McDowell in 2008. And the most recent edition, I think, was 2015. And then the pandemic hit, and so much about interviewing changed. And the book is about interviewing in software engineering in general. And Gail realized that there was kind of a need for an update. and I tag teamed with the CEO of Interviewing.io, who has a lot of data on the topic of interviewing because they are a mock interview platform. And we kind of teamed up to write a book. So that Aileen, Gail, myself, plus a brilliant technical editor named Nil. And then you get kind of the four of us to have the dream team to make the interviewing book, so to speak.
But it's still quite a step to go from software engineering to writing a book. As a software engineer, you sometimes write technical documentation, and you might write the odd blog post. But what made you actually decide to write a book or contribute to a book on the coding interview?
So yeah, it's a fun story. I actually kind of for the last decade or so throughout college, I found the best way to learn was to do like sort of YouTube tutorials on different things. So I made a YouTube and made it private and then just kind of shared with my friends like the concepts that I learned. And they're like, hey, you're good at this. Like, can you help study for interviews? Because it's kind of the same material of data structures and algorithms that I'd been doing. And I'm like, yeah, that sounds fun. So I went into it and I loved doing these kinds of problems. I was one of the weirdos that enjoyed the work. And after about, let's say, a year or so of doing that, then people were asking like, hey, can I pay you? Can I give you some time to kind of go through and like just kind of teach me the stuff? And that kind of led into many different kind of places that I worked. I ended up working about 5 different sort of side jobs at one point in time where they just would have different mock interview places to kind of learn. And they say that you need about 10,000 hours to master something. And I've totaled it up and I don't quite have 10, but I have about 5,000, I think, hours of doing like actual mock interviews with different people. And that doesn't include the study prep, which I'm sure is easily another 5. So maybe in total, I got 10,000 hours kind of practice with this sort of thing. And that helped me get really good at the coaching space. And that kind of led me to meet Aileen from Interviewing.io, who's like, hey, you're really quite good at this. Maybe we can talk about a book. Then that kind of just naturally led into, well, why don't we just contact the author of the best-selling book and see if they're up for a sequel? And so, yeah, and I'd done some smaller blog posts and things like that over time. So I thought I did that. And I had private writings that I'd been giving to clients for the better part of the last 5 years. And I'd looked at some of it and like just on one topic, backtracking, and another topic, dynamic programming, I think I had 100 pages. So it's like there was a lot of material that I was kind of giving out. So it kind of made sense to string it into a book.
Yeah, but why beyond the coding or cracking the coding interview? Because you mentioned that it was written in 2008, but then there were upgrades to it. So why a separate book then?
Yeah, so the original book was structured in a way that sort of assumed that you just needed to learn the basics of the material, and then that should be enough kind of to pass the interview. And it was basically a question bank. It had a bunch of different questions you could practice, and that was about it. But after about 2015, there were websites that came out that made questions easily available online. And if you're going to put a database of questions somewhere and you can do it either online or in a book, online's going to win every single time. So the update was mostly about how do we think through these technical coding challenges and how do we do these better? And so we put a lot more content in about actually how to pass the interview and a lot less on practice questions and stuff like that. And certainly there are still tons of questions in the book, but a lot of that could be offloaded online, like go see this problem online, go check this thing. So more time for the actual material on passing interviews.
Okay, so what's then in the book beyond cracking the coding interview?
Yeah, it's a mouthful. BCTCI.
Oh, no, I will get it right by the end of the interview.
You're good. And the book now is expanded. There's an additional sort of 10 topics, 10 to 15, depending on how you kind of count it, that are now popular within coding interviews, things that used to not be asked, but now are very commonly asked. So that just, updates of things that you need to know. So there's tons of extra technical topics. We have about 100 pages on not any one specific data structure or algorithm, but about 100 pages just on like, what is the actual formula for being able to pass any question? There are steps and common mistakes that we've seen now literally thousands of times people make and have good data showing, hey, these are problems. These are common mistakes that people run into with these sorts of things. What are the tips and tricks to kind of avoid that? And we kind of put that all in one place. And that's sort of the technical part of the book. I'd say that makes up maybe 2/3 of the content, but there's a whole other third of the book that's dedicated to all of my co-author calls it the squishy stuff, which is fun. It's all the negotiation. It's how long should your resume be? What should your resume look like? Do we care about LinkedIn? What if I want to get multiple offers at the same time? How do I sort of do air traffic control to manage multiple offers coming in? Everything from is your recruiter your friend to what is the best time of day to send an email to get a response from a recruiter. So lots of that kind of stuff too that people tend to have questions about.
And you're going to spill some of the beans at least in this
Happy to.
podcast.
Anything you want to chat about, let's do it.
I think one of the questions that I have, and you alluded to that earlier, in 2015, something changed in the way interviews are being done. And not just the questions, but also the format of the interviews. So could you run us through what actually changed?
Yeah, I think there's two things that made an impact. And funnily enough, of the two, the global pandemic was the smaller thing that changed. So the first thing that we'd say that changed is the pandemic that forced places to do interviews no longer in person, but fully remote. And that change meant that we'd have access to editors. We'd be able to code, directly, and we wouldn't have to waste time writing out things. It sort of leveled the playing field for folks that did interviews in Java, where it's just a very verbose language. And you had people that also would do stuff in Python. So it also kind of just helped even that out because you can type much faster than you can write, anything that you'd need to do in one of those two languages. In addition to that, it also changed the communication style pretty drastically. So if you're on camera, you almost are sort of putting up this performance, but now you don't have the ability to draw out your thoughts on a whiteboard. You actually have to draw them out in an editor, which means kind of relying a lot more heavily on ASCII values, knowing whether or not you can highlight something or not. People have all of these unconscious ticks that they do, I guess, for lack of a better word, where they'll say oh, this thing right here, and they'll point on their screen, but the interviewer can't see your screen, or you're sort of waving your cursor around and they don't know what you're talking about. So there's all these kind of communication things that are a problem. I'd say that's the first thing that changed. And that was non-trivial. It was kind of a big thing that happened, the advent of kind of remote work more. The bigger thing that happened, the thing that surpasses a global pandemic, is AI. AI kind of came out, and that has had a huge impact, especially if you're doing remote interviews. The release of AI means now more people can cheat than ever before. I mean, certainly you could have gone to a separate tab and Googled something, clandestinely in a remote interview, but usually there was going to be an in-person interview that would stop you from getting through the whole pipeline. And even if there wasn't one of those, to a certain extent, Google might help you, but it's not going to give you the exact answer to the coding question. AI can do that. You can just take a screenshot of it. And there are tools now that exist that I kind of actively monitor to see just what's possible, that feed you information that are literally designed to help you pass technical interviews, which has unfortunately made the game harder for everybody else.
But in the meantime, the pandemic ended and we're probably back to face-to-face interviews at some stage. Even at my time before the pandemic, because I did recruiting in the 2010s and certainly before, it was quite common to actually have a telephone conversation. It was a telephone conversation in those days. Yeah. And I remember an interview with Google, which I failed miserably, but I'm not going to go into that. I'm still having flashbacks. It was over 10. It was one of those screening interviews. And then they would invite you to the office. So are we back to that one?
Believe it or not, that's actually not something that has happened yet. I do predict that it will happen, but with any change in big tech, it's going to be sort of slow, and it's going to be through pressure that's going to happen. The problem at the moment is most tech companies got a massive stock boost. The second they said, hey, we're going to shave off hundreds of thousands of dollars every year and not fly people to California and then tie up, hours of engineering time and coordination efforts to get people to interview. If we can switch to a virtual interview, it just is a huge cost cutting measure to say now, hey, by the way, we're going to go back and now we're going to 20x our spend in this area. It's kind of a hard thing to justify to investors. The only way that that's going to end up happening is if a big tech company makes the stand that we are losing too much money hiring bad people than we are in making sure that we're not hiring people that are cheating. So there's quite a lot of shift there. And with any big company, things happen slowly. I do predict it will happen. But even if it happens, I still think there's going to be ramifications of the cheating aspect. So even before COVID, there was a phone screen, as you said, but we're still going to have phone screens after the fact. It's just effective to do some kinds of phone screens, but now it's still possible to cheat on those, which is going to make every interview harder.
What happened to the beloved whiteboard exercise?
I'm not saying that it's gone completely, but for right now, it's, let's say, hidden from view. I think there's something that might come out again, especially as people return to in-person interviews. But for now, usually those exercises are gone. The expectation is to write actual code in an actual editor for most big tech interviews.
That means also that technology has changed, because I think in the mid-2010s, There were some editors that you could use for interviewing processes. I remember that because I played with one of them. But I think it means that due to the pandemic and to other developments, we probably have now a plethora of different editors that are being used in interviews, isn't it?
There's about maybe a handful of different technologies that are very common ones for people to use. Anyone that kind of goes through the process these days in 2025, they're going to see links to editors like Code Signal or HackerRank or places of that nature. And these tools are sort of like collaborative shared editors. And some people even use like Google Docs and things like that to sort of collaborate quickly and not necessarily care about the whole IDE experience.
But the IDE experience probably is quite important in the interviewing process because you don't only want to see that people can code, but also that they can deal with the surrounding technology a little bit, don't you?
Well, it's interesting because I think most tech companies don't actually care if you can work with the specific technologies. The thought, I think, typically goes something like, if you can figure out how to look at a random problem and then do dynamic programming with that problem, you probably can figure out any IDE that we're going to use on the job. We'll tackle the problem-solving thing and then just assume you can pick up the technology.
Well, let's move on to the big questions now. The big question is, what is it that people are doing wrong in the technical interviews?
Sure. How much time you got?
Well, let's do the top three first.
Okay. Yeah. Top three things. So I realize this is not exactly technical, but I think it is maybe the top mistake I see people make. I think people assume that if they're a good software engineer, they should be able to do well in interviews. And I can see how people get there, but that is such a big mistake. Not taking the proper time to actually prepare will almost virtually guarantee you're not going to pass the interview. These questions have very little to do with intelligence and a lot more to do with speed, familiarity with topics, keeping kind of this stuff in RAM, so to speak. I think a lot of people just kind of go in blind or go in thinking they're going to do a week or two of prep and then kind of go in. Realize that your competition, there are many people for these big tech jobs that have studied, taken time off to do full-time studying for 2 months. And that's like 40-hour work weeks for 60 days. It's crazy the amount of effort people kind of put in to really get good at this sort of thing. And you can get good in a pretty bounded period of time. So I'd say that's probably the biggest mistake, not realizing that you need to invest serious time. The second big mistake I'd say people make is we always talk about, and I think if you were to go to any major place on the internet and you were to ask, like, how do we go through a coding interview? The thing everybody says is don't jump into coding too soon. So it's actually a very common piece of advice. And I want to kind of echo that piece of advice, but add a caveat for that to kind of make a little bit more sense. When we say don't jump into code too soon, people interpret that as think before just immediately coding, like maybe just do a little bit of thought. But I want to give a more concrete piece of information. The thing is, what you should be doing is you should think, what are all of the ways I can solve this problem? Maybe I can use sorting, but I could also maybe use a heap. I think there's a two-pointer way, and possibly there's a prefix sum that I can kind of exploit as a way of doing the problem. All of these tools, if we lay them out, and then say, hey, I could do this. This is algo 1. This is algo 2. This is algo 3. If you compare and contrast multiple answers before doing any code, so you're just roughly describing very high level what you think might work, that gives you a huge shot at getting the right answer. Yes, people jump into code too soon, but I think the bigger problem is jumping into the wrong solution quickly. So you have tunnel vision and you sort of focus on one thing and then just start coding it. Even if you plan it very well ahead of time, you haven't really explored all the possibilities. So exploring the possibilities, I think, is another big thing. That's two. The third one I'll keep short and sweet. And this one actually is, again, sort of tangential to the actual technical piece. I think people don't realize that you can push your interview. A recruiter is going to contact you someday out of the blue and say, hey, can you interview next week? And you don't have to say yes. You can actually say, I want to take some time. Please, can you give me maybe a month or two? And it's very common to push that off. People think that that's bad or it shows that you're like not prepared. But of course you're not prepared. You were contacted out of the blue. Even if you contacted them, you weren't necessarily expecting them to respond. So it's okay to take a little bit of time. And so just actually letting them know that you need time is another kind of piece of advice I give.
You mentioned that it takes some time to prepare for these interviews, even if you're a crack developer, right? And you tackle the most complicated engineering problems on this planet, you will probably fail these interviews. Well, how reliable are these interviews then for companies to get the right people on board? Because passing the job interview means you're good at passing a job interview. It doesn't necessarily mean you're good at doing a job.
That's so true. So There's been a number of studies that have come out of different places. Google actually has a vested interest in getting this right. So they actually threw a lot of money at this really early on. And they asked brain teasers. Turns out there's no correlation to job performance. They asked in-person skill-based things like, hey, here's a case analysis sort of assignment. How would you have gone about solving this problem that our team had? Wasn't super effective. I think the best thing that tends to be sticky here is something that you can ask hundreds of thousands of people, not need to worry about it getting leaked and then people just knowing the answer ahead of time because they know, Google asks this specific question. So it needs to be easily changeable. And then test something that's leveling the playing field. So certainly you could test mobile development or front-end development, but those technologies change so fast to where it's very difficult to test those things. The easier thing to do is to test something that everybody can learn because there are free available resources online, or most people that have a CS degree should have learned. And that's, I think, the thinking behind it. And that does lead to more effective outcomes. I can't actually quote the numbers, but there is research showing that this is better. And I think just for the reasons mentioned, if you want to ask about something more complicated, you're at risk of excluding a huge portion of the population that just doesn't know that specific area of expertise. Every developer thinks the thing that they work on is self-evident. Networking engineers talk to me all the time about networking things that I learned that in college, but I actually don't have any idea what you're talking about right now. So things that are self-evident for one person aren't for others. And so having something kind of standardized that people can study for seems to be very helpful.
So what kind of playing field leveling questions or problems are people getting? Obviously, the companies will adapt that and it will change. So what we're saying here will not be what you will experience in the coding interview, but just to give us a flavor of what it might look like.
Sure. Usually it needs to involve easy to understand ideas that just involve us to kind of apply critical thinking to figure out a way to do it faster. So a good example might be like if I give you an array of positive or just numbers, let's just say numbers in general, positive and negative, and I give you a value, we'll call it target. And let's say the target's 10, and I ask you, or let's just make it 0. If I ask you, can you find 3 numbers in this array that sum to 0 to our target value? It's a classic problem, and it's a good kind of example of kind of working through critical thinking. The easiest way to do this is just to have 3 sort of for loops, for number 1, for number 2, for number 3. You have sort of 3 nested loops. Let's just find the numbers, check does number 1 plus number 2 plus number 3 equal our target 0? It works, but it's cubic. So first, this shows immediately if somebody goes to try and do this, it's not that it's a bad thing, but do they realize how slow this code is? Do they realize the bottleneck they've created? And can they think through other ways of doing that problem? So that's kind of a flavor of it. So it's meant to be simple, easy to understand, has an immediate and hopefully apparent bottleneck that has the ability to be optimized with other simple tools that we've learned in data structures and algorithms. In this case, it'd be things like sorting, potentially binary search or hash maps, 2-pointer walking, stuff like that.
So how can people prepare for it? I think listeners might get a little bit scared, particularly those who think about changing their careers and probably have to go through this. But when you say preparing yourself for 2 months for a job interview, that seems to be quite involved. So how do you prepare yourself? I mean, in these 2 months, what do you do?
Well, I'd say it's not necessarily a 2-month experience for everybody. It can be done part-time, and it can just take less time, kind of depending on where you're currently at. So do me a favor, give me like an avatar for us to work with here.
The typical person that I'm thinking of is somebody who's worked in academia, started coding, say, on a research project.
Yes.
The research project is coming to an end. There's not going to be an extension. They're looking for a job, and they discover they like software engineering. So they would like to make a career of it. And so they're the ones now looking for a job in the private sector.
Okay, great. I love it. Very specific. I think at this point, they've already kind of learned the basics of coding. They know how to do for loops and conditionals, and they're already kind of familiar with academia. So I assume they can sort of make a plan and study it. There exist plans online that are anywhere between 8 to sort of 12 weeks that kind of exist. And you honestly can Google data structures and algorithms, 12-week plan or something like that. And what you'll find, no matter where you go, you'll find a couple of commonalities of just, hey, here are some major topics. I can include a link in the show notes if you like, of just a little thing from the book of just like what I call tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 topics. So tier 3 are very niche topics, and tier 1 are foundational important things. And these are things like, again, binary search, things like using arrays, using sets and maps, and then practice questions to kind of go through it. The typical idea would be to sort of just, let's start doing 2-pointer questions. Let's start doing questions where the answer is to first sort the data and kind of work through it. You'll find that after just doing a handful in each kind of category, they follow certain patterns that you can kind of apply. I'd recommend the book if this is a natural place to plug it. So that's another place to do it too. I'm happy to kind of leave a link there. But in general, the study plan should be bounded. You shouldn't study for months and months and months. You should be also actively mailing people and trying to kind of get recruiter attention and get job applications. I think people tend to want to first focus on the study prep and then get prepped and then start doing interviews. And they find that by the time you get interviews, now you've lost all the study prep because it took so long to get interviews.
One thing that is always very difficult to prepare for it, of course, is that people are very nervous before they go into interviews. How do you deal with that?
Yeah, I think people tend to be nervous for different reasons. Some people are nervous because they're worried they haven't prepared enough. And full disclosure, a lot of people haven't prepared enough. I think people just kind of underestimate how much you need to prepare. So some of it's just like you can get better at these things and be less nervous if you have done sort of enough prep. If you don't think that's the reason that you're nervous, some people have done the prep, but they haven't actually done enough actual practice in front of another human. It's an interesting experience to have somebody else watch you code. So pair programming is kind of a good way to get around this. If you have somebody else that's also actively working to maybe do a job hop or a job switch or something like that, you can find people online on forums and things like that that'll pair with you, and like they'll ask you a question, then you'll ask them a question, and that can be really effective for that. And then I'd say the third kind of biggie in the room is just like some people are just anxious and they're just never, some actors have stage fright every single night that they do a performance, regardless of how often they do it. And so just figuring out how to manage that kind of becomes, some people use medications for that. Some people use breathing techniques. Some people are into yoga, and that's figuring out your own thing that you do to kind of help calm yourself in the moment and kind of get through it.
I think one thing that I just popped in my head was, okay, you can prepare yourself for the technical questions like sorting and dealing with arrays and et cetera in different programming languages, the kind of problems, data structures and algorithms. But there's also the environment, these coding interview sites is what I mean. Is that something that people can prepare for in advance, or is that something that the recruiter, that's a bespoke solution, they throw it at you at the time that you do the interview?
The typical way that most people prepare now is to go to one of maybe 2 websites. There's a very popular one called LeetCode. Are you familiar with that by any chance?
No, I'm not. No.
Oh, sweet. So it's a cool website that's basically a question database where you can go and you can practice. I think they have 3,700 questions last I checked. So there's lots of different ones. They're all tagged with different things. They have a built-in editor, so you can write there, run your code against some tests to see if you pass the solution, and then look at editorials and stuff like that. This isn't an ad for LeetCode, full disclosure. We also have, again, another place on Interviewing.io where it's kind of linked to the book, where if you want to practice a question, you can kind of go directly to the website, and there's an AI interviewer that pops up, and it acts just as an interviewer, and it asks, how would you go about solving this? You talk to it, and it kind of mocks as an interviewer. And it's a really nice experience to sort of practice the actual interviewing piece, because interviewing is not the same thing as doing coding questions. Like they're kind of 2 separate skills.
Indeed. And you just mentioned the keyword AI and bots. I think your website has a section of how not to cheat, or how easy is it to cheat with ChatGPT or Copilot and all the other tools that people nowadays have at their hands and use in their coding anyway on their daily basis, but maybe also in an interview. So how do you deal with that, and how do interviewers and the companies, how easy is it to detect someone who's actually cheating and, copying, pasting something that Copilot throws back at them for a coding question?
Yeah, so I work pretty closely with the CEO of Interviewing.io, and we do blog posts and stuff like that. And Interviewing.io is her website, not mine, but I do think that the whole work that I do very closely, I think I tend to get tied pretty closely to the website because I'm an enthusiastic supporter, I guess we'll say. The cheating experiment that we did last year was all about seeing how many people in these mock interviews, we basically pay them to see if they could get away with cheating. And 100% of them got away with it. Interviewers were clueless at the time. Now, that was a year and a half ago at this point, I think. So a year and a half goes by, and all of a sudden, a lot more cheating tools kind of come out. And there's been some big splashes in the news now of people cheating. And so it's even more mainstream for people to realize that it's cheating. And now it's actually getting a lot harder. These tools, the places where you actually do the tests, start having like visual indicators to interviewers that an interviewee might be cheating. It'll say things like, hey, this candidate just resized their window. This candidate left the tab and is now on some other tab. This person just copied something from the editor. This person just pasted something into the editor. So there are tools to kind of help detect it, but nothing's sort of foolproof. What I'd say is that this is kind of a constant battle now where AI enthusiasts that are interested in cheating build a new cool feature that makes it look like there's no way you can't figure out how to cheat. And then companies build a new thing that kind of helps prevent it. And it's sort of this battleground of tech.
Well, which will continue. But I think it's always been a little bit of a battleground because there has always been people who've been cheating in exams and coding interviews.
Absolutely.
But coding interviews, well, interviews in general don't only consist of coding. There are also other things that can go wrong.
True.
So particularly when you're coming from academia and you're trying to find your foot in the private sector where things may run a little bit differently. So we talked about the 3 common mistakes that we had for coding interview, cracking the coding interview. What are the top 3 for failing the interview, the more non-technical part?
The obvious one for, if we sort of like lean into stereotypes for a second of software engineers not necessarily caring about the soft skills, being able to communicate well. The easiest thing is that people give no attention to the behavioral interview at all. I'm not saying that you need to have a 5-year plan perfectly mapped out to explain what you want to do with your life vision and be able to explain that in an elevator pitch. But having some practice around the behavioral interview goes a long way. And so much of these interviews and the level that you end up being at as a software engineer is dictated by your responses to the behavioral, not the technical. People assume that the behavioral is sort of a throwaway and the technical is what matters. And certainly the technical matters. You're probably not going to get an offer if you don't pass that technical portion. But the way that most companies level you is by doing system design and behavioral interviews. And the behavioral interviews, they might ask a question like, hey, what was the hardest project you worked on recently? And if you start talking about a bug that you fixed, that says something different than if you talk about a cross-collaboration initiative company-wide that affected 100,000 users. So it says something about what your level of seniority is, and that's kind of how they use that data to sort of give you an offer based on that. So I think, not being familiar with the behavioral interview and leveling your answers appropriately is probably the number one thing I'd see. Does that make sense? Any questions on that?
Yeah, no, it is. But go on to number 2.
The second one I think is probably just very closely related, the system design. Coding interviews matter an awful lot. And I'd say especially if we're talking big tech companies like the Googles, the Metas, the Amazons, the Netflix, the thing they care about certainly is coding. In addition to coding, though, they're going to care about architecture. They're going to care about how would you design a system. And I think people make the mistake of thinking that they can't know because they've never designed a system. Like they can't know about distributed systems because they've never worked on distributed systems. They need to first get into Google before they can then have the system design experience. And couldn't be farther from the truth. I think it's very easy to learn when and how to use a message queue and how these things work. But it kind of requires additional studying. There are certainly resources online for that, same as data structures and algorithms. But you don't need to have worked on it in your day job to be able to design a system intelligently. And I think that's kind of just for whatever reason, a mind-blowing concept for folks that have never done it before.
So I don't know how to put this, but the interviewer. So we talked about AI and chatbots and cheating in coding interviews, but how far has AI entered the space of the recruiter? Do they use that for, say, analyzing the data? Do they use that as an assistant to select candidates, even up to the final stage? Or is that restricted to some stages?
I'd say that recruiters have always been overworked. And right now you have AI bots that can auto-apply to 1,000 jobs for one person, in a couple of seconds. So they're getting overworked even more. I've seen some solutions proposed for recruiters to be able to screen candidates more effectively. But the problem is, if you sort of code AI to do what recruiters do, you'll find a couple of biases that sort of emerge, because humans have biases. And a couple of the big biases that sort of emerge are that if you're going to screen resumes, the big things that you really look for end up being, did they go to an Ivy League school? Did they have a good GPA? Do they have a name brand on their resume? And that's not the only things they care about, but they are overwhelmingly interested in candidates that sort of meet that profile. If you then code that into an AI bot, you're coding in, like, let's say, ethical problems, I suppose. So there's been some resistance to actually screening candidates that way, even though it's been happening for the last 20 years without AI. I'm not aware of any specific tools that are actively being used for reasons like that, because it necessarily ends up screening out people in ways that most people find highly problematic.
So there is a little bit of hope for humans still.
This is true. This is true.
But the question that I'm leading up to was, how do you see recruitment actually going to change in future? So we've seen quite a big shift now, haven't we? So I think there's still the environmental shift from most interviews being taking place remotely instead of in face because of the distance and other reasons. AI having an impact for good or worse. And what else do you think is in store in terms of the recruitment process and the way people still get jobs?
First, acknowledging that this now we're talking about crystal ball territory. So it could be way wrong, but here's my take. I think we're going to see a couple of changes. The first one, I think that is imminent, is there's going to be a shift back to in-person interviews. And I don't think it's all going to be in-person interviews, but I think that will now become a mandated part before hire happens. We're actually seeing early signs of that at both Meta and Amazon already. And a lot of people thought that what was going to happen is the questions were going to change. So instead of being asked these data structures and algorithms questions, maybe we'd reinvent the process into something better. But again, the problem is doing any other process at scale tends to be difficult. So instead of reinventing the wheel, I think companies are going to take the path of least resistance, which is, again, just including that in-person element once more. I don't think that the phone screens are going to go away, but I think there are going to be tools that we're going to be asked to start using that are going to help limit the people that are going to be cheating. So a good example of that is people with disabilities that couldn't go in for years would take the SATs and like other standardized tests remotely. And the way that they do it is they'd use sort of proctoring software. So you download software on your computer, it sort of scan and make sure you weren't running other things on your computer. It'd let you open up one browser that would go to one very specific site, and then you could go take the test. And it'd like watch you from your camera, and then you'd have like another camera set up behind you and things of that nature. I think we're heading in that direction, but for interviews as well. So not that there couldn't be cheating, but it would just deter the vast number of people. The other thing I'd say is, I think right now, if you think through emails and phishing within emails and how common that is now, I think the average person knows what email phishing is and the scams that are involved with clicking links unintentionally. I think interviewing is going to be a little bit like that, where there are going to be some common red flags that people are just going to be highly suspicious of, that right now maybe are common, not things that people necessarily realize are going to happen, but very soon are going to become very problematic. A good example of that is people saying, oh, I'm sorry, I'm having webcam issues. My camera doesn't work. Like, that's not going to fly in an interview anymore. And right now, I think people are already starting to be suspicious, but some people would still let it slide. But that's going to be a hard stop and the interview sort of situation going forward. Other things of that nature are also going to be, I think, increasingly common. And it's going to just be having good security hygiene around this as interviewers, training people to sort of watch for specific things, I think is also going to be extra important. The only other thing I'd say that I think is likely to change is that there might be an additional element of randomness where you might be given a question, and instead of it being from this big question bank of 3,500 questions, AI might start generating questions for you as well. I still think they'll be in the data structures and algorithms rounds, but there are some companies that have built their whole career, like their whole business model off of giving you access to good questions. And now AI can write pretty decent questions and then have tests that pass it with solutions that we care about kind of for free. And I think that's going to be something that enters the space fairly soon as well.
The upshot is that interviewing is still going to be hard in future.
I do think that is the case. I don't think interviews are going anywhere. I don't think data structures and algorithms are going anywhere. And I don't think that much of the process on our end is going to end up changing. I think the studying is going to be largely the same for a long time yet.
At the end of the day, it's about the technical skills, but also during the interview, you find out if it is actually some person that you would like to work with as an interviewer as well as an interviewee. Is it the company you want to join or not?
Absolutely.
So what's in store for you then, as a final question? I mean, you've written books, you've written blog posts, and you're a software engineer. Are you still a software engineer, or are you dedicating your life to teaching other people how to prepare for interviews and writing books?
I still like to claim the identity of software engineer. It feels like something that'd be sad for me to drop entirely. But right now I'm kind of exploring what the next options are. I don't think I have a good answer for you. There's a chance I go into content creation because I think there's a lot of people that are still confused about parts of the interview process, and I could see value in doing that. YouTube, quite frankly, is daunting to me, the amount of hours that you need to put into it. I appreciate your podcast as well, and podcast seems like there's just a lot of hours that go into these things that I never knew about until I started looking into it. So I'm not totally sure what the direction is, but maybe some content creation of some kind. And maybe I go back to work. I don't know. I've considered maybe just trying my hand at interview rounds myself at Google and the big tech companies now that I'm free once more.
Well, as Mike just said, job interviews aren't going anywhere, are they? And just as I was wrapping up this episode, I saw a post on LinkedIn that said that Google interviewers are going back to in-person interviews. In particular, the post said that, and I'm quoting, reports suggest that over 50% of candidates are now suspected of using AI tools off camera to solve real-time coding challenges during remote interviews. Some Google employees, they continue, have even called on leadership to ban remote interviews altogether, arguing that they no longer reflect a candidate's true fundamental knowledge. So there you go. It seems that Mike was spot on in the interview just now. As for the tools that are used for coding tests, I included links of some of the tools mentioned in our conversation and, of course, the link to Mike's book as well, in case you want to check it out. Next week, we're going to talk about something very, very different. My guest Sebastian Weber from France will talk us through a Python library that he hopes will make it easier to hook up to measuring instruments and make data acquisition a doodle. The tool called PyMudak. And see you then. Oh, time's up. See you next time. But before I forget, this podcast is covered by the Creative Commons license. See ya.